Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to you who are joining us from Vienna and Paris. Good evening to you, Bruce, who's joining us from Canberra. So it's always difficult to be the moderator of the first panel in the very early in the morning, but we'll do our best. So I have, as Bruno mentioned, the subject of our panel this morning is global home fronts, and we'll talk about how the recent developments in the field, scholarly developments in the field, had an impact on understanding the home fronts. We have 5 distinguished speakers this morning. We have Annette Becker, who is a professor at University of Paris and Nanterre. She has, as you know, written extensively on the 2 world wars, extreme violence they nurture, with an emphasis on military occupations and the 2 genocides, Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. Her latest book, fortunately and beautifully, I don't know if you'd agree, but beautifully translated into English, as The Messengers of Disaster, Raphael Lemkin, Jan Karski, and the 20th Century Genocides, and published pretty recently by the University of Wisconsin Press. We have Mary Cox, who's joining us from Vienna. She's an assistant professor at in international relations at Central European University, now in Vienna. She's broadly interested in the impacts of war on civilian populations. Her book, Hunger in War and Peace, Women and Children in Germany, 1914-1924, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. She's now writing a book on the impact of World War I, and international humanitarian aid on children in Vienna based on anthropometric data collected for each city district. A quite fascinating subject. On my left, we have Sheldon Garon, the Nissen Professor in Japanese Studies, Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Princeton, a specialist in modern and contemporary Japanese history. Sheldon Garon also writes transnational global history that spotlights the flow of ideas and institutions between Asia, Europe, and the United States. His many publications include Beyond Our Means, Why America Spends While the Rest of the World Saves, Molding Japanese Minds, The State in Everyday Life, and The State and Labor in Modern Japan. Garon is currently writing a transnational history of home fronts in Japan, Germany, and Britain in World War II. We have Victor Louzon, who's joining us from Paris. He's an assistant professor of history at Sorbonne University and associate researcher at Center of History at Sciences Po. His research interests focus on war, colonialism, and political violence in modern East Asia. He has published articles and book chapters on the subject, and he's currently working on a book manuscript concerning the February 28th incident in 1947 in Taiwan. And finally, we have Bruce Scates, who's gratefully joining us from Canberra midnight there. He's a historian at the Australian National University. He's a novelist and documentary film producer. His many publications include Return to Gallipoli, Walking the Battlefields of the Great War, A Place to Remember, A History of the Shrine of Remembrance, and A New Australia, Citizenship, Radicalism, and First Republic. And also, I cannot go without mentioning that he also penned a great historical novel on dangerous ground, A Gallipoli Story. I can recommend, cannot recommend it enough. So, as Bruno mentioned, we have a different format this morning. Rather than being a boring panel presentation you're all tired of, we have although we try to have a vibrant discussion with the leading experts of the field. So let me begin our discussion by asking a broad framing question about the home fronts, about globalizing the understanding of the home fronts. How can you define, based on your own research, looking from within your research, how can you define home front? And how has your research addressed its central aspects and dynamics? Let us begin with the panelists who are joining us virtually.
Should I go first, or should Mary go first?
Mary, would you like to go first? You have to unmute, I guess.
Hi, sure, I'm happy to go first. So you can define homefront in many different ways. I guess a very simple definition is just the people who are, usually I say people who are living where physical fighting is not going on. So the non-soldiers could be expanded. And oftentimes this sort of gets mixed around, depending on conflicts. War often comes back to people on the home front or soldiers return home. But my main interest, I guess, in my research for the home front is actually to try to better understand the effects of war on different groups of people. So questions like who suffered nutritional deprivation, when did they suffer, how much did they suffer are key questions that I'm interested in. So I like to look at things in terms of gender, age, social class, urban versus rural divides, things like that. Often, if we say home front, there's sort of this beautiful imagination of women, home, providing foodstuffs and writing letters to their men on the front. But home front also includes men who aren't fighting, old people, young people, and rather than just see this group as one homogeneous mess of people, in my research, I try to kind of tease out different ways that they're affected.
Mm-hmm. So. Making the war, in other words, making the war experience much more complicated. Victor, would you like to continue?
Sure. Hi, hi everyone, and thank you very much, Bruno, for all the organizing and putting together this great non-panel apparently. So very briefly for me, like I don't use the concept per se. What I encountered the question of what we now term home front for this conversation during my research while researching the militarization of society during wartime. And so Mary just said that we usually tend to define home front by all these people who take part in the war effort but don't actually fight. What I was interested in the context of the broader of the Japanese wartime empire was the mobilization of these non-fighters, but in institutional forms and modes of organization that are borrowed from the military. So I guess what I was mostly interested in my research was to see how war did not actually initiate a movement of militarization, because this actually predated World War II. So my research was on colonial Taiwan and then Manchuria and Korea, but actually accelerated process of militarization of the organization of some sectors of society, and then how this militarization processes spills over into the post-war period. So actually the way I approached it also touched on the question of chronology and how does the home front stop? Like, does it stop when the war ends, or does it stop later? So yeah, that was my approach to this question. So mobilization and militarization were the concepts I used to approach this question.
Mm-hmm. We'll actually come to that point. I mean, you made a great point about the home front. When does the home front end, or does it ever end? So we'll discuss that just shortly. But Bruce, would you like to continue?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess coming from an Australian perspective, one of the distinctive things about the home front is just how far away it is from the actual theatres of war. So, what, 15,000 kilometres from the nearest major theatre of war. The phrase that's often used is that the men who fought that war came from the uttermost ends of the earth, and this distance has often been emphasised. And I guess in other ways too, Australia's home front is cushioned from the effects of war in a way that European countries are not. It's long been argued, of course, that we don't see the wholesale starvation, the movement of refugees, the homelessness that was a lot of millions of people in Europe. And most important of all, I guess, is the sense that, and this is coming back to Mary's point, that the men who fought that war were absent in a very real sense. What I mean by that is that able-bodied men did not return to Australia in periods of leave the way that they may have done in France or in Britain. So that sense of remoteness was very, very strong. But I can't begin to, I rush now to qualify all of that, in that it seems to me that the boundaries between the home front and the actual front are really quite permeable. They're quite porous. I think that recent scholarships alerted us to the militarization of society at home. It's alerted us to the way that the war is carried home, particularly when the wounded do make their way back to Australia in 1915. And also, I think the assumption had been that the civilian population knew very little about the conduct of war. And that's certainly not the case. The work that I've done on bereavement, for example, makes it very, very clear that families know what's going on. They suspect what's going on. The casualty lists tell them what's going on. So this kind of constant engagement between the front and the home front is something that I've been very interested in. And in particular, I've looked at how the war came home through repatriation. We've had the release of repatriation files in Australia, which show us how the war continues to affect society long, long after the fighting ends. So I guess what we're looking at here is the collapse of old historical understandings, certainly in Australia, and embarking on new scholarship.
It's apparently a very healthy development. Now let me learn to dear Annette Becker.
I think coming from a perspective in French language, home front didn't exist till very recently.
Mm.
We were speaking till 20 years ago of back.
Mm.
There was the front, which was only the military front, and it was the back, which was all the rest. And the back, I would say, was backward. And in the last generation of researchers, because we became transnational, we began to hear home front. And we just had to dig a little better, because the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who was a soldier during the First World War and a journalist, did write in 1917 a very interesting little piece about how we should call our war. And he had all kinds of things. He was already thinking about Great War, because it came immediately in 1915, actually. He spoke about World War. And then he finishes the article by saying, but the war of the fronts will be much better. And reading that and working with people from England and the United States speaking about home front, we realized that actually there was not a front. There were, I would say, hundreds of fronts. And that the home front was not her front. It was also hundreds of fronts. And if you take this globalization as totalization, you have exactly what is the new scholarship. And that's why this conference is so rich, because the idea one front has been just totally broken in so many fronts, because what was called the militarization of society, it's true for certain parts, but you can be very affected by war without being militarized. And so we have to stop to think in terms of war, fronts, military. This is part. It is a small part of the immensity of the war. And I think the word front works for home front, and it works probably for home front because home is a basic cellar of all societies. Everywhere in the world, where you are, you have a home. And at a certain point, this home is affected by war in a way or another. Not military, it could be economic, it could be for the gender, the problem of specific problem of women, live with kind of violent terms, and so on and so on. So I think to think this way will push us in the different spatial and temporal, like Bruno said, but also in all kinds of human behavior we can study. And I think it is really very rich now, this notion.
Fantastic. Yeah. Sheldon, how would you conclude this round?
Yeah, so in my work, I've tried to do what Bruno said. I've tried to be broad, both temporal and spatial terms. And so I'm actually writing about many home fronts from 1914 all the way through the Second World War in 1945. And when you take that approach, so I'm going to do what some historians do, rather than trying to give an ideal type of a home front, I'm interested in how it evolves, both ideas and practices. And, you know, the fact is that I think Annette just referred to this, that a home front does not emerge fully formed in 1914 in the European war. In fact, I mean, in Britain, they don't even get to rationing until the last year of the war. They don't have much labor conscription. Civil defense against aerial bombardment obviously starts very late. It's very rudimentary. Even the use of women has sometimes been exaggerated in a lot of the European cases. So it's something that's being formed. The word home front is seldom used in Britain. It's used sometimes in Germany in the First World War, and also in Austria in various forms. But usually when it's used in the Central Powers, the idea of the home front is almost a front that is subversive against what the army is trying to do. So we don't really have much of a transnational usage of home front. In my work, really not until about the early 30s do you really see it. And so, but why is the concept important? Well, the concept's important because things are just being formed in World War I, and they're being formed at different paces. The Germans and the Austrians are getting to food much earlier because they have to, because there are blockades and things like that. They're getting to questions of morale earlier because morale is suffering more. But the whole thing takes time, and it's very interesting. Everything is circulating. Home fronts are learning from other home fronts as it goes on. War is a very competitive thing. And so my work, I mean, it does something a little quirky. It actually introduces Japan. And everybody's probably thinking, why would you introduce Japan in the First World War? They weren't doing much. Well, they weren't doing much militarily. They had a very easy war, but they had a lot of time on their hands and a lot of money that they didn't have to spend on the military. And they sent lots and lots of bureaucrats and military officers to Europe to observe in various countries what mobilization of civilians looked like. So in other words, they had to actually try and define what a home front was before there was a very coherent concept of home front. And it's very interesting. They make it look much more pure and simple than it is, and yet they distill transnational lessons that become very important for everybody by the Second World War, because the Japanese are not the only people doing it. They just happen to be very clear. So they see the mobilization of women as never before. They see labor conscription in places like Germany as never before. They see the beginning of civil defense. They see lots of food rationing, food diversification, things like that. And they have kind of guidebooks that they bring back. I mean, voluminous reports that then become part of governance even on peacetime home front and interwar Japan. But it's very interesting. They're not the only people doing this. They become these transnational lessons. And by the time you get to 1939, the Japanese have a home front that they've defined by 1937 against the Chinese, because it's an earlier version of the Second World War. But by the time you get to 1939 in Europe, it's interesting that most countries know what a home front looks like. So the British and the Germans, they've stockpiled food, they've got civil defense, they've got gas masks, they've got air raid shelters, they're moving labor conscription. So it's just interesting. I'll just conclude. It's home front is a more dynamic process rather than, I think, an ideal type.
Yeah, I mean, all of these are very, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but all of these are fantastic points. I'm looking at 5 different historical examples. We see the emergence of a new type of conflict. So as a historian of World War I, I'm very careful not to reduce everything to World War I, but I mean, really, we see the emergence of a different type of more total, if I can use this term, more comprehensive, more impactful type of conflict, which really encompasses all sections of the society, which probably had the luxury to remain aloof from the conflict before World War I. But now that's changing and changing very dramatically and very fastly by learning from one another, by interacting with one another. I mean, your answers touched up on this, of course, but let me turn the attention a little bit to the scholarship. Looking again from within your own fields, how has the evolution of the field progressively collapsed the false binary between the front and the home? I mean, you mentioned that, and this is an ongoing process as well, but I really see a renaissance, if I may, renaissance of war studies in that direction, especially through the issues of like occupation, bombings, blockade, internal enemies, and to what effect, and so what? How would you describe what happened in your field in that regard? Mary, would you like to go again? I don't want to put you front, but
sure, I'm happy to go first again. So I think for this question, I'd like to actually maybe talk about blockades a little bit, just because that's an area that I've done a bit of work on. And what's interesting about blockades is that you can't, if you issue a blockade, I mean, unless it's, we're trying more and more now to sort of target them. If you think about sanctions now against specific Russian oligarchs, those are meant to just hit those individuals. But it's really hard to do in practice, and it was even more difficult 100 years ago. And so if a country issues a blockade, even if it's used as a military tactic, it's inevitably going to hit the home front or civilians. In the First World War, what's interesting is that leading up to the war, there were different sort of rules that were meant to relegate or meant to sort of allow neutrals to continue to trade during wartime. So you have the Paris Declaration respecting maritime law in 1856, and then more famous, the 1909 Declaration of London. And in there, basically, forgive me for being really technical, but there were basically 3 ideas of contraband. So there was absolute contraband, which meant that it could be seized at any time. Then there was conditional contraband, which was sort of halfway in between, and it could basically be taken if it was shown to be going towards an enemy military. It's sort of vague, the language, but basically military, or maybe government would then send it to the military, and then areas that were not contraband. And food was right up there in conditional contraband, this sort of halfway in between. When the First World War broke out, His Majesty's government changed that really quickly. They sort of issued not declaration, but issued an adjustment, which moved conditional contraband into absolute contraband. And so this sort of legally, I say sort of deliberately, because it's, the fact that they could do this on their own is sort of debatable, but made it very quickly that this supposed separation and protection for neutrals that these agreements were meant to do were kind of taken away. And so that immediately brought then this false binary, which you said, between the home front and the other front away. But you asked, what about the literature? And I think, the blockade of Germany, as it became known, or the British blockade, there's lots of different terms for it, has been controversial over the past 100 years for different reasons. But if you look at the language very early on, there the division between the home front and the military is taken away. So at the time, people who were doing it would say, oh, well, this is not deliberate. And those are interesting questions, but you kind of see that going legally and then longer effects of it going on. But yeah, blockades are just interesting because we see, are they weapons of war? Are they tools of peace? They sort of fit this boundary, because even though they're affecting civilians just as much as the military, governments then have the decision to, or they have an option of stopping the war and stopping the blockades. And they're not as violent. They're slow moving. Normally you think of war as, being shot or having a bomb on your face. A blockade, if you're hungry, then that's going to be a slow moving impact. So yeah, so this would be a false binary, I guess.
That was certainly the case in the Ottoman experience. As you know, British and French navies blockaded the Eastern Mediterranean, which prevented the shipment of food to Lebanon, which eventually led to the disaster, a huge big Lebanese famine in 1915-1916, which probably killed 300,000 people. And its legacy is very deep, very vibrant, still in, after so many generations among the Lebanese, especially Maronite sections of society. Victor, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, sure. So my research kind of straddles two fields, which is, let's say, the history of the Japanese Empire, especially in wartime, and the history of China. And so I guess I should answer on both fronts, if I may. And because I think of course, these are very different fields, but in some extent, a similar process seems to have happened to me, which was not so much the collapse of the boundary between home front and the front, but the discovery that there was a home front at all, in a way. Because it seems to me that the very notion of home front kind of presupposes that there is some kind of solidarity between the army at the front fighting the enemy and the back, right? The arrière, as we say in French, and that is in a way part of the same war. And I think these two ideas are not self-evident, both when you look at Japanese colonies during World War II and when you look at China. And for instance, Taiwan, since it's the topic I studied most, but more generally, the relationship between the Japanese war efforts in what was very much perceived as a Japanese war and not a Taiwanese war or Korean war, of course, and its colonial hinterland was perceived as one of pure predation for a very long time. So there was, of course, interest in the way resources were tapped, in the way, to some extent, but there's not much research actually on the way conscript labor worked in these places. And there was, of course, a very understandable reluctance, especially from on part of Korean Taiwanese scholars, to admit that there had been some kind of overall mobilization of societies, and not just soldiers sent to the Japanese army, but societies in support of the war efforts. Of course, I'm not saying a deliberate effort, but an overall effort that wasn't just conscripting people and stealing resources. And I think what the historiography has kind of tended to highlight these past maybe 20 years is that to some extent there was actually, and that the war effort actually reshaped colonial relationships in a much deeper way than what was thought before. And that this notion of home front, in a way, of course, with all the caveats the colonial situation imposes, is actually a useful category to think about what was happening in these places. And if you go to the Chinese side, to the history of wartime in China, which is of course a very different situation because you don't have a colonial situation. I mean, at least the relationship between the countries that does the fighting, the regime that does the fighting, and the population is not a colonial one. However, we have this image of the Chinese state, which is not entirely false. I mean, we shouldn't, go too far the other side, as a completely inept. I mean, I'm talking about the nationalist regime, right? As a relatively inept regime that was most of all very disconnected from its own society, and that was basically able to mobilize men, resources, and goodwill only through sheer force, pure force. And it seems to me that in a way, the same process, of course, like all things being equal, happened in the field of Chinese studies, whereby some scholars, and of course, I think of Rademacher's students and Rademacher himself, for instance, started to pay more attention to the way civilians in China actually took part in the war efforts, not just as pure victims of government predation, but also as in a way concerned persons. So I guess that would be I would paint this kind of maybe simplified narrative of the discovery of the home front in these two bodies of historiography.
In that sense, the discovery of the home front, quote unquote, contributed methodologically for us to understand the war and its impact in different ways, in novel ways. Bruce, how would you look upon this from the Australian experience?
Yeah, I think the home front's discovered very early on in an Australian context. It's interesting that Sheldon's remarked that it does take a time to evolve. But when you look at, say, the earliest historiography, the foundational historiography, the official histories of the First World War, there are 12 volumes in all. Most, of course, deal with the major theatres of war in the various armed services. But there is a volume that is set aside specifically for the home front, written by a Melbourne historian, Ernst Scott. I think it's partly to pay tribute to the patriotic workers who played such a key role in providing the army with both the material and the morale that they needed to prosecute that campaign. But I think what I'd like to do now is highlight how that simple compartmentalization of home front over there in volume 12 and the rest of it somewhere else has broken down in Australia. If you look at the most recent scholarship, Joan Beaumont talks about a continuous dialogue between the front line and the home front. And indeed, in her book, she moves constantly between what's happening at home and what's happening in the battlefield. And I don't think you can understand the defeat of 2 conscription referenda in my country, bitterly fought those campaigns, unless you knew what was going on, the slaughter that was accelerating right across Europe and how people responded to that. I guess if I had to highlight some really important moments in the way that scholarship's evolved, it would be the work of Michael McKernan, who coined the phrase manufacturing the enemy. With the war so far away, there was a need to somehow imagine a threat at home. So you had Australian society dividing. The internment, for example, of Australians of German descent served no military purpose whatsoever, but it did galvanize fear and hatred within the community that you needed to prosecute that war. And I guess the other really promising aspect of this work on the home front would be, of course, the intense scrutiny of gender and the way that women are thrown into public prominence in so many different ways, through patriotic societies, through fighting the conscription referenda, across a vast and very different political complexion. So I think it is a really dynamic area of scholarship at the moment in Australia, and it's moved on so much since Ernst Scott wrote that early volume back in the 1920s.
It's really fascinating to see all of these developments are, manufacturing the enemy is almost a global process. It's happening to all the battlegrounds. Or the women's contribution to the labor force, for example, opening up a new type of public sphere, militarized public sphere. So all of these are happening across the board almost. So that gives us a fantastic opportunity to compare and contrast different home fronts, right? So Annette, how would you go?
I really like the sentence by Michael said that Bruce just gave us manufacturing the enemy.
We all love that idea.
We all.
So everybody was taking that.
It's not surprising that Michael McKernan, with good sense of formula, would do it. I think it goes really so well with the new scholarship, what I'm working on now about military occupation and genocides in the 2 world wars, because mainly what was a new engineering of society. Society was under the cover of war, engineering, which could have taken place in another situation, perhaps, but under the cover of war, they did it. They did it in Turkey, with the Armenians, and the Nazis did it first in Eastern Europe and then in Western Europe because they had the military power to do it. So you have really the manufacturing through this huge engineering, which is what is a home front. It is a place where you think you can have the society at your hand. And there are people, groups, minorities that you don't want anymore. And because you have the power of war, you can either kill them, deport them, and kill, which I think is even more important in a way for the new society to be born. You kill your culture, their culture. And it was one of the great regrets of Lincoln that in the convention on 48 on prevention and penalization of the genocide, he could not put the culture. So the other people understood very well that it was the cue. And all his life he regretted that cultural genocide was not in the convention. And I think during the war, it's in a way easier to kill people than to change them. But the aim is to change them, and you do it by culture. And you can see it through the Turkish perpetrators, and you can see it through the Nazi perpetrators and their collaborators. And we could speak a lot about what is going on now between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we tend to forget that, but those genocides also took place under the war conditions and the home fronts. So Armenian genocide in that regard is an inseparable part of the Ottoman home front, or the Holocaust is an inseparable part of the German home front during the war. So Lemkin is right in that regard, right? You know, whenever culture becomes so important, symbols, rhetoric becomes so important, a cultural genocide should also be part of that, but unfortunately couldn't convince us. So Shell, how would you?
Well, so if we're talking about sort of how historians have recently approached the collapse between home front and battle front, I mean, there's so many things. I mean, I would break my answer into sort of the comparative transnational on the one hand, and then my own immediate case of Japan on the other. And so, you know, I would join Annette in thinking that there are several things that collapse home front and front, and you just mentioned genocide, atrocities, and Mary mentioned blockade, and I would add bombardment, because bombardment and blockade increasingly went together after the First World War. They just kind of started to go together right at the end, but then, of course, by the Second World War, bombing was even more important than blockade. But they were all often seen as a set of in a sense, bringing the front home, so that you're not safe. I mean, not only are you hungry because of blockade, but you are about to get bombed. And so there, the front really has come home. So I'm not sure where the historiography is on that in the comparative terms, but I found it very convenient to think of home fronts under stress as a special category. So in the United States, it's sort of the ideal type of a home front that's not under stress. I mean, Americans might not accept that because maybe they had to, you know, get some sort of higher ration and they thought they really suffered. But compared to people living in the Soviet Union under Nazi occupation, or the Japanese getting bombed, or the Germans starving in the First World War, the Americans are not a home front under stress. And for that matter, Canada, Australia for the most part, New Zealand. But then you have at certain times in these wars when home fronts come under stress, not all the time. So Britain is definitely a home front under stress in the early part of the Second World War. It's getting bombed, it's getting blockaded by U-boats, and then it gets a little unstressed as the war goes on, except for V1 and V2s, but that's not a big thing. Germany and Japan increasingly are home fronts under stress. They're increasingly bombarded. In the Japanese case in the Second World War, nobody knows this, but they're blockaded severely by the end of the war to the point that people are near starvation. So in these ways, the home front comes home. Now, Japan, specifically the historiography, I don't know if anybody really wants to hear this, but it's not particularly good. on the home fronts. I don't think most historians of Japan have seriously wrestled with the problem rather than trying to analyze the home front. They simply assume it. So the Japanese take Manchuria in 1931 and 32. Lots of the literature acts like a home front was created then. In fact, it was a great time to be alive in Japan. Japan came out of the Depression quickly. People had jobs. 3,000 people total soldiers died in the whole taking of Manchuria. It's a very low-level war. There's no home front, but people assume it. The war in China starts in 1937. Then the Japanese do use the term home front, but it's still not a particularly stressed home front. The Chinese can't bomb them. The Japanese can bomb the Chinese. There's no food scarcity at all until 1940-41. So we need to really think analytically. The problem in Japan, and I'm just venting, if anybody is out there watching the Zoom, they're probably gonna be really angry. But the reason that nobody understands a home front in Japan is very few scholars of Japan actually understand when the war occurred. Because there's a term 15 years war, 1931 and 1945, but it's not a continuous war. It has many different objectives. It starts, it stops. It has different stresses on the home front. So because they haven't been able to define the war and periodize the war, they can't really periodize the home front. I will stop it there.
No, that's a great segue. So all of these answers actually give me an idea that with the changing nature of the war, civilians are becoming increasingly and gradually legitimate targets of violence, right? Be it a genocide, be it bombardment, be it blockade, with increasing frequency and increased level of violence. So in all of these examples, even in the faraway home fronts like Australia, we see that, right? Civilians are becoming increasingly integrated parts of the war effort. And again, we see, I mean, this is probably a development that began early on, but really we see that it reached to a high point in World War I and continued to increase after that. So Sheldon's last point gives me an opportunity to ask a question about periodization, because we all talked about how nebulous a concept home front is. Let me ask this. How should a global history of war, the subject of our panel today, address home front's periodization? So Sheldon mentioned the assumption that the Japanese home front started with 1931 Manchuria. Do the home fronts come into existence with the declaration of war and come to an end with its conclusion? Or shall we assume a broader periodization of that? They started before and ended after. And how flexible that concept is. I mean, are we living in a home front now, for example? When exactly does a home front come to an end? What would you say if I ask something like this? Mary, again, would you like to start this round?
My pleasure. Let me think. When does a home front start? When does it come to an end? I mean, separate from historians, I think for governments, our leaders in countries, especially when a war has ended, but the circumstances on the home front haven't changed, and they usually don't change very quickly. That's not always the case, but often the case. They sort of wish that the home front could continue, that you could continue to mobilize people for a greater cause. But when the war is over and people, for example, in Vienna are still hungry, and there's new governments going on, then this sort of loyalty, which is maybe never as strong as they wanted to have in the beginning, your patience is pretty thin. If you've been on the home front doing your best for 4 years and then the war is over, but yet you're still sort of on the front. So things might change. They still change gradually, but things, there may not be physical fighting. But going back to the idea of blockades, perhaps a blockade is lifted. It might not be immediate, but even if it is immediate, those trade routes that were disrupted don't immediately come back quickly. They take a while to get going. Crops don't immediately come. I mean, I'm reading a book by, what's her first name? By Ingrid Ditzwart on the Hunger Winter. And, she shows very well that I think for many of the Dutch people, once they were liberated, food supplies came in really quickly. And so there was over the summer of 1945, there was a change, but a lot of times there's just not. And so for historians, defining when a home front starts or when does it end, I think this is going the way of war in general. So we talk about the First World War, and it used to be, I guess, that the war ended in 1918, but of course this is problematized because fighting continues in different places, especially in the East. And so we kind of expand that. And I think it's the same with the home front. So conceptually thinking about it, there's this idea of what historians should do and also what actors themselves sort of did or how they viewed things. And I would say, at least in my research, that for people on the home front, maybe the war has officially ended, but their circumstances have not. And the frustration just mounts. And this is also then when you see oftentimes, revolutions and changes in government, I think because of this frustration.
Yeah, especially when it comes, I guess the scholar consensus now is World War I did not end in 1918. When did it end is, of course, jury's loud, and there's no consensus about that. For some, it still goes on, right? Okay. Victor, would you like to continue?
Yeah, so that's a tough one because I think it points to a difficulty in the notion of home fronts, and that to answer this question or to try, I think we have to decompose it a little, because like if we mean war bringing, being brought back home in terms of civilians being hit, like whether directly physically or economically, well, then of course except for hunger and maybe economic destruction, it has to stop with the fighting. So, but it doesn't need to start with the fighting. Like for instance, in the Japanese colonial empire, the war is brought back home through hunger first, and some body bags, of course, because some colonial soldiers are sent to the front. But you only really have to start to have like blockades and bombings of Japanese colonial territories quite late in the war, right? It's very clear for Taiwan and Manchuria, for instance, when they feel the heat quite late. So this is like, of course, in a very narrow sense of the term. If by home front we mean the general effort, so more metaphorically, of civilian societies, at the service of the war effort, then the question is like a lot more, the chronology is, of course, is a lot more blurred, because this kind of mobilization and sometimes militarization of the forms of organization in society may well start well before the war, right? Because that's part of what modern states do. So there's no reason that they should stop with the war. But then, is it really useful to go to home front, onto just like, dealing with something else, which is the mobilization of resources by a state, which sometimes serves a war effort and intensifies very much, and sometimes doesn't. And I'm going to take a very simple example, like in mainland China. It is completely impossible to understand what Maoism was, even economically speaking, in terms of the modes of economic mobilization, without understanding, without taking World War II into account. I mean, it makes no sense. Mm-hmm. To some extent, this is a country at war with itself and a society mobilized under wartime conditions until well into the 1960s. Is it really useful to go to home fronts given that there are internal enemies? I mean, we may, but I'm not sure what we gain from it. So I would argue maybe for a very narrow and impoverished definition of the term in this case, because it metaphorically very much so, but I'm not sure how much that helps. I mean, I have to think more about this. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, your answer reflects, of course, the current status of the field about the home front, right? I mean, we are not there to specifically define the concept of the home front, let alone its periodization. And what I understand from your answer is we should be really careful not to bend it too much to make it useless, to make the term useless, right? Bruce, in your previous two answers, you gave us many examples that the home front actually does not end with the end of the war. What would you like to say specifically about this?
I guess I'd say that probably the most impoverished periodization is that advanced by the Australian government. that argued that war fatalities really stop in 1921 when the first AIF is disbanded. What's very, very clear from any study of repatriation is that communities continue to bear the cost of nursing men and women who are dying of war-related wounds and injuries and illness for decades after the conflict has actually ended. So in terms of the physical trauma that's visited on a society, it doesn't end neatly in 1918 or even well beyond that. The other point I'd make, and it comes to what Mary was saying about the long-term impacts on economies that wars have. The Australian economy contracted by about 20% during the war. It was shocked by the disruption of shipping lines. It goes into a period, of course, of severe drought in the 1920s, and then it faces the 1930s depression. So for the home front actually never recovers from the trauma of the First World War. Very different scenario what we see in the Second World War, where the economy is actually stimulated by war. It's not the case for World War I. And indeed, there's just to end on, there's a brilliant oral history that's conducted by Janet McKelman that wrestled with that very question. When does the war end? What does it mean to us? And it's a soldier saying, well, really, I had a job from 1914 to 1918. I didn't have a regular job until 1939. So that's the way that he actually saw the war, as one long sort of series of traumas that affected himself and his community.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a similar case in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. The GDP of modern Turkish Republic, the levels of 1913 GDP of the Ottoman Empire could only be reached in 1950s in Turkey. So the war's impact continued for decades, actually. And it's true for many other areas as well, like the livestock numbers, for example, or a total devastation. The impacts of that continue. Annette, how would you?
I would be even more radical than my predecessor, and agreeing with everything which has been said. I would say that it never ends. And I will say it in the scholarship. Mark Bloch, our master, all of us would say that the historical questions are posed by us now, and he was a medievalist. And obviously, he would not be the same medievalist if he had not been a combatant in the First World War. It was extremely important for him. I will take one example, is the example of environmental, I cannot say ecologist history today. I mean, it is all questions of today, and we understand that the environmental history for the two world wars is absolutely a huge phenomenon now for France and for home France, and it was never studied before because it was not a question for the historian at the time. So I think it never ends for the scholarship, but it never ends also, and I will follow totally Bruce on that, on the minds of the people. And this goes from one generation to another in different ways. And obviously the First World War doesn't end in 1918. Now the scholars more and more say that it ends in 1923. You know why? And it's true, but it's not true for the people who have been into it. It goes till the death, and then it goes to the children. And nowadays, I think the idea of the post-memory is very, very important to understand how, even in your genes, at some moment, you know that you are part of this war time, even if you have nothing to do with war, you know. And I think, alas, the war in Ukraine, the aggression against Ukraine, has taught us this a great deal. And in the last months, it was very easy, sadly, to think about these things in a new way. And I think the literature is very important for that, films also, but literature perhaps more. Why certain writers write about the home front, the First World War from now, and teach us something. And it is their imagination, their research, obviously the archives, but their imagination can give us a new perspective, a new prioritization, a new civil society that at whole. And it's a good lesson for historians.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I would add to what everybody said, but I would take a somewhat different focus and think about continuities of a lot of the home front programs of civilian mobilization. And there we see, I'm not going to say absolutely the home front continues everywhere, because it doesn't. It depends on the place and the time. But it is very interesting between the two world wars, how you see a great anticipation in many countries that there's going to be a second world war. And there's a tremendous anxiety starting from probably about the late 1920s. And so one of the fairly concrete ways I've dealt with that is to look at programs of civil defense against aerial bombardment. And it's very interesting that if you look at Germany in the late 20s, the Soviet Union, Poland, Japan, they are all starting frenetic efforts to protect their populations from what they think is going to be aerial devastation in the next war. And so they're really beginning to form or reform home fronts, but on a different basis now. It's not just blockade now. Now it's really bombardment and urban destruction. And so we see that sort of continuity. And that kind of leads me, I like this paradigm of the second 30 years war. It's kind of a war that seems to start and stop. And so we have that sort of continuity. We have maybe more mundane, we call them in Japan, trans-war continuities. Nobody uses this in Europe except Phil Nord, my colleague, because we play tennis together. But this idea that there are things that develop in wars that continue afterward. I mean, we're all familiar with it, even if we don't have a name for it. But if you think even of Britain, after the First World War, well, they're certainly not doing things on a militarized basis in the interwar period. But what they are doing is they're continuing things like the war savings campaigns, and a lot of nutrition campaigns then become recycled in post-war in Britain, post-World War I. So we get these national savings campaigns. And then after the Second World War, in lots of places, Japan and Europe, because of the devastation of the wars, the civilians still come out quite mobilized in terms of savings and austerity campaigns that keep going. And the British have food rationing until 1954. So a lot of the vestiges of the home fronts continue. And I suppose you end with the US, kind of the strangest case. But so civil defense pretty much shuts down in most places after 1945. Yes, you can visit bunkers in Berlin and things like that. But the Cold War, it does not excite people in post-war Europe or Japan, but in the U.S., I mean, I remember as a school child, we did air defense, civil defense drills all the time. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis, so the 50s kind of felt like a home front in that respect. So I think you have to look at, I don't want to just say existentially home fronts continue. That's the state of humankind. But I think you can look at these concrete continuities.
Focusing on the programs and the institutional regulations. Okay, perfect. It's almost 10. And my dear colleagues here are warning me now. It's time to open the floor to audience. And our virtual audience can also write their writing the questions. You can write your questions in the chat box. Dave, talk, please.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm David Hoffman, Ohio State. Let me first thank the panelists for some very interesting comments. Wanted to pick up on Shell's last comment about sort of civilian mobilization in the interwar period. It made me think about the expansion of state control and state intervention in society that results from World War I. You see this especially with economic controls, but also in public health. We have ministries of health created in countries across Europe and around the world in the wake of the war. Once these institutions and government expansion occurs, it never really goes away. One of the little known facts about the Soviet planned economy was actually modeled on the German World War I economy. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to address the ways in which, this expansion of state control, state intervention, and the institutionalization of those things actually then sort of perpetuates what we see in the interwar period and even post-World War II period.
So in other words, long-term impact of the intervention in the home front during the war is lingered.
Right. Yeah.
So shall we collect, I mean, all, shall we actually?
Yeah, collectively,
Collect, yeah, let's collect a couple more.
Yes, John was before me, but I think.
Ram, please, go ahead.
Just to pick up also on Sheldon's last comment in the US is also an observer. The same in Japan is for World War I and World War II, and there is a massive project to learn from the bombing from the home fronts in Europe. I would like to ask about the long-term legacies, because I see the legacies of militarization of the home front in the US up till now, even with the war on terror, militarization of police. I mean, I wonder what your thoughts about the war on terror coming home in maybe the longer. I mean, I know we stopped in 45. Maybe we can think about more current events. I would argue that there's continuation with nuclear war to the war on terror to even now with American home front.
Theoretically, we are open to extend it all the way to.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the point that you made about political and economic mobilization of the home front continuing after the First World War. I think there's something similar happening after the Second World War as well. And as you were discussing, Shell, Japan, I was thinking of Tony Judd's comments about welfare capitalism in the UK coming out of this wartime mobilization. There's also some work by Jan Gross about how Nazi occupation, economic, political occupation during the Second World War in Central and Eastern Europe is sort of adapted by the communists to create a stronger executive to take control politically and economically in the post-45 period. So it comes back to Victor's point about Maoist revolutionary mobilization, that's present also in places like the Balkans and Yugoslavia and Albania. But I also think top-down political and economic mobilization of the home front has an afterlife, and it has a very politically consequential afterlife after 1945.
I guess these three questions are good enough.
Questions.
Let's start here this time. Shall would you or Annette, would you like to answer?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that David's comments, I think, are right on the mark. I mean, that, I think we know these things. We don't think of them in terms of civilian mobilization and state intervention. And when you put it in the language of war, it becomes very interesting. And after both world wars, you get a lot of this effect. And also the point about Jean-Paul, the Tony Judd welfare state. I mean, Beveridge report obviously comes out during the war. So these things are important. I think I would the one answer I would give just to caution us is at some point, I think civilian mobilization does break down. Now we've got a crisis with the winter coming in Europe, and so I understand the French government just called on everybody to set their heating at 19 degrees Celsius, which by American standards is like a war crime. And I don't know what's going to happen in France, but the whole point is, for the last 40 years, no American president could call on his people and ask them to sacrifice for anything. We've had no conservation campaigns. So there really is a point where the state of war ends, at least in some places.
My point would be, I really agree with you on the political level, that the democratic societies and the totalitarian societies still jump on the war. They still are in it. And they have different ways to accommodate, but it goes on. But it is not my specialty, so I'll let you say it. But I totally agree. But I would speak about what I think it was the first word of Mary at the beginning, sufferings. Because this is the thing that you cannot decide that at some point it stops. And how long the suffering are going to be for the military people who come back home and bring the suffering, their trauma with them. And for the people, everything they have been suffering through the war in various various ways, from bereavement to personal torture, or rape, and so on. This never ends. So there is no question that it will finish when the last people will have lost it in his memory. And we don't know when, but it's still not finished.
Especially when we consider that, in the case of the genocides, for example.
Especially in the case of genocide, but not only.
Not only.
Not only. I would take the First World War because it's further. Obviously, for the Armenians, a few weeks ago, I visited the daughter of Armenian survivors, and just recently, her daughters were my age, decided that there was a lot of photos of the family, and it was not on the walls. And she showed me the apartment redecorated with the people who have been killed in the genocide. Obviously, before the genocide, in the beautiful outfit, the day of the wedding, and so on. And it was 2022 that we did that. And so the home front of Istanbul was in Paris, and such a long time after. And she was telling me about that. A colleague, a very educated person, but she was reviving the genocide. So it never ends.
Apparently, yeah. Bruce, Mary, Victor.
Sorry, yes, of course. I think that the war does lead to increased state intervention in society. The very first piece of legislation introduced during the war is the War Precautions Act, which is basically designed to control society and to stifle dissent. And what interests me most as a historian is the authors behind that legislation. These are the same people who in the 19th century were part of a labor movement that engineered the social laboratory of the world. And what happens during the Great War, I think, is that we lose all of that. We lose that youthful idealism, we lose that sense of social justice, and we become an incredibly xenophobic, and there was always a racist element to it, but it's exacerbated so much through the process of involvement in that conflict. So I guess, yes, of course, that the way that the state enters people's lives and tears them apart, that's something that's the lesson that emerges from World War I to me. And I guess too, if I can highlight, just to bring it back to the home front again, those failed experiments, what do we do with the men and women who return from the war? How do we integrate them back into their civilian lives? And what a colossal failure those things were. Soldier settlement saw over half of the men and women put on the land walking off within a decade. So the human tragedy of this is simply enormous, and it's one that I think the scholarship is yet to really grapple with.
That's one of the very important subject that we focusing on world wars should continue to study, right? And Victor or Mary, go ahead, please.
Just a quick comment. I guess going off of what Annette said made me think about. So I've been talking about suffering, but with Homefront, there's also a lot of mobilization. And Bruno wrote a wonderful book about humanitarian aid that came out of the First World War. And what we see is that a lot of these organizations continued. So then they're being mobilized. Often then they go outward. So for example, if you look at, say, the children, it's initially started to sort of help children in Austria and in Germany, but that quickly then expands to other countries as well. It started in England. And to this mobilization, I think this response to suffering, people want to be involved and they want to keep doing things. So I don't know if this is like an international home front, maybe conceptually that's not really fair to say, but there is sort of a, that could be one way to think about it in terms of not just the memory of suffering or from the bodies that people continue to care for, like Bruce mentioned, but also just this expansion of generosity and the response of people wanting to be involved in alleviating suffering, whether it's from the people in their vicinity, like maybe during the physical fighting, to maybe that then expands beyond people's own borders.
Victor, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, maybe very, very quickly. I completely agree that what we actually have to do as historians is locate specific examples of things that survive, after the official end of war or not, and that a very general discourse is not enough. About China, there is, so in the Chinese case, in a way, it's much easier than when you study, for instance, European history, or at least Western European history, because the wartime, post-war continuities are not hidden at all, because the political vocabulary in which all these like state mobilization is conducted after 49 in China is very much couched in martial language. So there isn't like hidden continuity. It's completely, it's for everything, it's in the open for everyone to see. And for instance, there's a very simple example. The system of the public company, the Mao system of the public company, which was quite specific because you had public ownership of the company, but you also had an organization of the private life of the workers by the company at a very, very granular level. It was what was called the unit, like in Chinese. And this, we know now, is very much designed during World War II by the nationalist government and not the communist government, in a relatively, of course, in a non-socialist but technocratic way, to organize the production of munition, for instance, of war-related industries. And so there is very, very direct and continuity between the war and the post-war mobilization, the war and the post-war. However, you should also add, in this case, that a lot of Chinese communism after 49 is quite closely modeled on Soviet communism that is itself inspired by war communism, right? At the end during the Russian Civil War, and which is of course an experience that the Chinese did not experience themselves. So it's kind of difficult to disentangle like the learning process from war to war, in a way, from war mobilization to war mobilization to civilian regime, to peacetime regimes like the Chinese communist regime. So on the one hand, and on the other hand, the direct inertia of an actual war happening in one place and having post-war effects. So I think we should be maybe, like, I would be a bit careful maybe in saying that the effects in terms of not in terms of suffering, but in terms of mobilization and the organization of society, that the effect of one war never ends, because the actual process is that there are several wars that states learn from in the process of mobilization, both during wartime and peacetime. So again, like maybe my main concern would be that this could lead us to dissolve the notion of home front in the notion of, let's say, war preparedness and the mobilization of society by the state, which is, of course, in which war is a very, very potent accelerator, which is a feature of modern state history, like not just one war or some other war. I don't know if I'm being clear.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so for our last 5 minutes, we have 2 questions from the remote attendees that both deal with how we spatialize home fronts. And one is Masha Serovich asking if the participants, maybe particularly Annette, could comment on how occupied territories can or cannot be subsumed into the military category of the rear. And our colleague Chris Reed asks Victor specifically if he could comment more on the home front in colonial Taiwan, what that looked like. Thank you.
I think I did in the past. I did a book where I called the military occupied territories of the First World War laboratories of total war. And I will stick to this idea of laboratory because it was not organized at all before. They had no idea. Either the German army or the Russian army or the Hungarian army had no idea they will be in a few weeks in the middle of the enemy territory with all the civilians not knowing what to do with them. So it was very much a day-to-day organization and more and more violent because we didn't know how to deal with it. Mainly, if it had been organized, it would have been not so difficult. So I would I would stick to this idea of laboratory and to see really well the interaction between the occupied and the occupiers. Because the occupied, they are at war also. They are agents, they are active. They think they are French, they think they are Serbians, they think they are Russians, and they don't want to be under military occupation. They still fight the war. So they don't really think they are home front. They are at war. They are military front, but they are civilian. That's why I call it a laboratory. I think it's very important to see it this way.
It's a fascinating process, of course, to study. Yeah, to live through. But
For an historian, it's a wonderful place to study, but I'm sorry to say that.
I don't want to learn that level.
Especially because there are much more women, because and children and old people, because the men in age of fighting have been mobilized. So they left for the military front, and who stayed behind are the people who don't fight or cannot fight. And so there is a gender issue there, because the one who occupy, the occupiers are male who fight. And so the gender issue is particularly strong, and the age issue is very, very strong in this territory. That's why there are laboratories in all kinds of ways.
All different dynamics.
Yeah.
Shall we turn to Victor for
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Victor, would you please answer our colleague's question?
Very shortly, I promise. I think we should distinguish maybe three things. So like the use of Taiwan as a kind of launch pad for imperial expansion in the 30s, which was in the 30s, and then the actual implication, the involvement of Taiwanese in the war efforts of the fight capacity, and then brought down and the way they start to suffer basically at the end of the war. And in the 1930s, Taiwan starts to be mobilized. I'm just going to give one example. Seiji Shirane is going to publish a book on the way Taiwan became a rear base for the production of knowledge on Southeast Asia, because Taiwan is used by the Japanese authorities as a kind of launch pad for southern expansion. So including the production of knowledge on these countries that are going to be conquered or at least controlled in some capacity. It doesn't mean that the Taiwanese feel that they are at war. It's a very elite phenomenon. It doesn't concern the mass of the population. Then when the war starts with China, so it's 37, but most of all it's 41. When the Pacific War starts with the Americans, you start to have actually military mobilization of the Taiwanese and the Koreans. Actually, it starts slightly before in Korea, but the Japanese authorities try to keep it as remote as possible from the concern of overall society. And it's also an expeditionary force, right? So it's people who go away, and some of them come back in body bags, as we say, but not literally at the time, of course. But it's not. It takes a while until the whole of Taiwanese society is kind of involved in this war efforts, either through conscript labor or through training, and then at the very end of the war, conscription, actually, like full-on conscription. And so I would distinguish a third and last phase, which starts for me kind of late, like in 43, 44, especially 45, where it really starts to hurt through two phases. So you have the killed, of course, on the front, so people lose dear relatives. Then you have dearth, like they start going hungry basically in 1944, mostly 43, 44, when the Americans start basically destroying the Japanese ships that that provide the island with foodstuff, and then you have the American bombings in 45. So again, I think this points to the several meanings we can give to the word home front, which is kind of plural. And according to the meaning we choose, the chronology is not the same.
The plurality, in other words, the plurality of the home fronts, which of course we can apply to all other contexts as well, right? So it's 10:20 here. I am smelling coffee and tea. I guess it was a wonderful discussion. I hope you agree. Please join me in thanking our participants here. Especially Bruce Scates for joining us as well, 1:30 or something like that in Canberra. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bruce.
Enjoy your sleep.
Thanks.
Have a lovely afternoon, Vienna, Paris. Hope to see you in person in Columbus. Thanks.
Yeah.